Lena had danced through hours of rehearsals, the music pulsing in her veins as she moved across the floor. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but her mind, her passion, would not allow it. She had a vision in her head, a perfect performance, every step and spin fluid and graceful. She couldn't stop. Not until everything was just right. She would take one more step, fix one more angle, but as the final notes of the music echoed in the large rehearsal space, a familiar pang hit her stomach, sharp and unmistakable. It had been hours since she'd eaten, hours since the last time she'd even thought about food. She had skipped lunch because she was so wrapped up in rehearsing. There had been no time, not with the pressure mounting for the upcoming performance. But now, the gnawing hunger was nearly unbearable. It was as if her body had just remembered it needed sustenance, and the ache in her gut was becoming more and more persistent. Lena had always prided herself on being strong, on pushing through whatever challenge came her way. But even she could not ignore her body's growing demands. Her stomach growled loudly, a noise that seemed deafening in the silence of the empty studio. Lena's stomach was empty, a hollow cavern of longing that seemed to echo with every passing moment. The physical sensation was undeniable. The gnawing, unsettling emptiness spread throughout her abdomen, a constant reminder that she had ignored her body's needs for far too long. She had been so focused on rehearsals, on the perfection of each movement, that eating seemed like a distant afterthought. But now, as the hunger set in, it felt impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a vague discomfort. It was a constant, insistent pressure that only grew stronger with each minute. The first sign of trouble had come quietly, a low grumble deep within her core that was barely noticeable at first. But as time passed, that quiet rumble intensified, the sound swelling until it was a thunderous growl that reverberated through her entire body. Her stomach churned, a deep, guttural noise that sent a shiver up her spine. It wasn't just the growl. It was the rhythmic way it pulsed, as though it was desperately trying to communicate with her, demanding to be fed. The sound was almost painful, as if the very walls of her stomach were stretching and contracting in an effort to stave off the emptiness. It made her feel weak, a vulnerability that she hated. Here she was, strong, confident, in control of every step in her dance. Yet her own body, her own hunger, was betraying her. The growls came in waves, louder and more frequent now, like the deep growl of a wild animal in the distance. Each rumble seemed to echo in the stillness of the studio, filling the air with an uncomfortable tension. The noise was almost embarrassing, so loud and out of place, like a reminder that no matter how much she had achieved in her art, she was still just a human being with basic needs. Her stomach felt like an empty pit, and the silence between the growls was just as unnerving. After each rumble, there would be an eerie, hollow quiet. It was almost as if her stomach was waiting for something, anything, to fill the void. The emptiness became more pronounced during those moments of stillness, and the quiet was almost deafening. It was a constant reminder that her body was pleading for attention, for sustenance, for something to fill the aching space inside her. Lena's mind raced as the sounds became louder, almost frantic in their urgency. She could hear the way her stomach seemed to talk to her, twisting and gurgling in distress. The sound of liquid sloshing around as it desperately tried to digest the nothingness inside her was enough to make her feel unsettled, even panicked. It was a constant pressure, like a weight inside her, urging her to eat, to do something about this growing discomfort. It was no longer a simple ache. It had evolved into a constant reminder of how deprived she truly was. Her body became more sensitive to every noise, every little sound. She could feel the fluttering of her pulse in her stomach, the tight, almost unbearable sensation as the acid churned in protest. The emptiness wasn't just physical anymore. It was a gnawing hunger that seeped into her mind, affecting her focus and her thoughts. The growls seemed to deepen, like a haunting chorus, and each sound only reminded her of how much she was craving. It wasn't just food that she longed for anymore. It was something deeper, something primal, that came with the realization that her hunger was about to take over. The strange sensation of hunger and emptiness made her feel out of control, like something inside her was ready to snap. Every time her stomach growled, the sound seemed to vibrate in her chest, a loud and unyielding reminder that her body was no longer in sync with her mind. She could feel her senses sharpening, her focus dwindling as the hunger overtook her thoughts. And in those moments, her mind betrayed her, imagining the sensations of consuming something, anything, that could fill her up, something that would make the growling stop, something that would satisfy the gnawing desire inside her. But at the same time, it made her feel small, powerless. Here she was, a dancer with complete control over her movements, but when it came to the primal need for food, she was just as vulnerable as anyone else. It was a humbling experience, this constant reminder that no matter how strong she was, no matter how in control she appeared to others, her body still had needs that she could not ignore. The growling, the gurgling, the way her stomach seemed to hum with desperation. It was a reminder that she was only human. Each time the hunger made itself known, it brought with it a deeper sense of urgency, a sense of unease. The emptiness became unbearable. Her stomach seemed to protest every minute, every second she waited to eat, and in the moments between each growl, Lena felt a heavy emptiness settle into her bones. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a need for food. It was a longing for something deeper, something more primal, something that only the satisfaction of her hunger could fix. She reached up, wiping sweat from her brow, trying to focus on the moment. Her backup dancers, who had been working alongside her, were now taking a well-deserved break. They were just as tired as she was, catching their breath and stretching after the intense routine they had perfected. These dancers were more than just colleagues. They were her family. She had known them for years, and they had always been there for her. Each one brought something special to the team, and Lena trusted them completely. But as she watched them, something strange began to stir inside her. It was subtle at first, just a fleeting thought, but it quickly spiraled into something darker, more primal. She saw their small, delicate figures, their movements so precise and elegant, and the hunger in her stomach was no longer just about food. The emptiness inside her, the hollow ache, began to feel different. Her eyes lingered on one of her backup dancers as he stretched by the bar. His back arched gracefully. Something twisted inside her, a deep, powerful hunger that wasn't just physical anymore. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. This was crazy, she thought. She was tired, hungry, and stressed. She had to stop thinking this way. But the feeling was persistent, a strange and nagging thought that wouldn't go away. Lena's mind wandered as the other dancers continued to stretch and chat among themselves. She tried to focus on the moment, on the tasks at hand, but the hunger was distracting, pulling her into thoughts she couldn't control. She began to imagine, just for a moment, what it would feel like to consume the dancers, to devour them, filling the void inside her. The thought made her stomach twist, and she quickly stood up, pacing in the corner of the room, hoping to shake it off. She couldn't stop. The thought seemed to take root, turning into a strange, almost obsessive feeling. Lena's thoughts were in turmoil, as if a storm had taken over her mind. She stood there, staring down at her tiny backup dancers, who were no larger than the size of her hand, moving cautiously and gracefully in the vast, surreal forest. Their tiny forms, though delicate and precise in their movements, suddenly seemed so vulnerable to her, almost too small to exist in such a large, dreamlike world. The hunger that had gnawed at her for hours was no longer just a physical sensation. It was primal, raw, and all-encompassing. The gnawing emptiness in her stomach had transformed into something far more intense. It wasn't merely the absence of food, but something far more visceral, something deep and unspoken. It was a hunger for more. It was as if she could feel the pulse of every living thing around her, and the dancers, her friends, were like the perfect, fragile morsels that could fill the aching void inside her. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked down at them, those tiny, perfect beings that she had worked so closely with, laughed with, shared secrets with. In the quiet of the forest, as the dancers continued their practice, her mind began to drift. The thought of picking them up, of tasting their energy, of consuming them to satisfy her overwhelming hunger, felt strangely tempting. For a fleeting moment, Lena imagined the sensation of feeling them in her mouth, of holding their tiny bodies against her lips. She could almost taste it, the idea of them filling the emptiness inside her, their softness, their energy, slipping down her throat and becoming part of her. Her heart raced, and a sickening, electrifying feeling crawled down her spine. The idea of consuming them, of taking something so precious and intimate, took hold of her thoughts with an intensity she had never known. Her hands twitched, involuntarily reaching toward the dancers. She imagined their fear, the panic in their eyes as they realized just how powerless they were in this strange new world, under her control. But then, in the quiet space of her mind, there was a flicker of something else. The hunger was so intense, so overpowering, that it drowned out her sense of morality for a moment. She could feel the power within her, the ability to take, to dominate, and it sent a dark thrill through her. The temptation to act on these urges was almost overwhelming, and for a moment she questioned herself. Was she just a dancer, a performer, or something darker? Something that needed to dominate, to consume? Was that all she was now? Yet, even as these dark thoughts swirled in her mind, there was an inner struggle that she couldn't ignore. These were her friends, her family. They were the ones who had always supported her, who had helped her perfect every move, every performance. She had danced alongside them for years. She had laughed with them. The guilt began to rise within her, a rising tide of regret. She loved them. How could she even think of hurting them, of letting the hunger turn her into something monstrous? Her thoughts were torn. The hunger raged inside her, screaming for attention, demanding to be satisfied, and yet her heart ached with the weight of the realization. She couldn't stop herself from imagining the feeling of holding one of them in her palm, feeling their tiny body press against her skin. She imagined gently lifting one of them to her mouth, the warmth of their form resting against her lips, the softness of their skin as they quivered beneath her. She imagined the moment of swallowing them whole, feeling their forms slide down her throat, disappearing into the depths of her. But the more she imagined it, the more distant and terrifying it became. She wasn't some predatory beast. She wasn't this monster her thoughts had made her out to be. The hunger, while consuming, was born from exhaustion, stress, and a lack of nourishment. She couldn't let it win. The urge to give in was strong, but the love she had for these dancers, for her friends, was stronger. The thoughts filled her with shame, but they also made her realize just how much they meant to her. And just like that, the moment passed. The dark, insatiable hunger still lingered in the back of her mind, but it was no longer overwhelming. Instead, it was just a dull ache, something she could face and eventually control. The tension in her body eased slightly as she set the tiny dancers back on the ground, feeling the weight of the decision she had just made. They were safe. They would always be safe. She knew it was absurd. She loved these dancers. They were her team, her friends. The bond they shared was one of trust and mutual respect. She wasn't a monster, but the hunger, the gnawing emptiness was becoming unbearable, and somehow the idea began to feel less impossible. It was as if her mind, starving and exhausted, was grasping for something to fill the emptiness. Lena closed her eyes for just a moment, the exhaustion finally taking over. Her mind began to drift, her body sore and tired from hours of dance. But as she closed her eyes, the world around her seemed to shift, as if the very air had changed. When she opened her eyes again, everything was different. The familiar walls of the studio were gone. Instead, Lena found herself standing in a massive forest, surrounded by towering trees that reached toward the sky. The soft, earthy scent of pine filled the air, and the floor beneath her feet was soft and damp, the grass thick and lush. The studio had disappeared, replaced by this wild, dreamlike world. She blinked, confused, trying to process what was happening. Her mind was foggy, clouded by hunger and exhaustion, but something felt off. The forest stretched out in every direction, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. The sky above was dark and rich with stars, and the soft hum of nature was the only sound that filled the air. Yet the eerie stillness around her made her skin prickle with unease. And then she noticed something. The tiny forms of her backup dancers appeared before her, scattered across the ground, moving in unison as they practiced. They were no longer the size of regular people. No, they had shrunk, becoming mere specks of life in this vast forest. Lena's breath hitched as she watched them, unable to comprehend what was happening. The dancers continued their movements, unaware of her towering presence above them. She looked down at her own hands, noticing how large and powerful they seemed. She felt strangely strong, like she could crush anything in her path. The hunger in her stomach roared again, more intense now, and it was no longer just hunger. It was a primal urge to take. Her dancers, her friends, had become so small, so fragile. She leaned forward, drawn to them. The idea of devouring them, of filling the emptiness inside her, grew stronger with every passing second. She could feel the warmth of her breath on her lips as she leaned in closer. The thought of picking one of them up, holding them in her hand, and tasting their energy consumed her. The urge to consume them, to taste their softness, to feel them fill her empty stomach, was overwhelming. The dancers stopped moving when they noticed her, looking up at her in fear and confusion. But Lena couldn't stop herself. The hunger had taken over, and all she could focus on was them. One of them, a small figure who had been practicing a pirouette, froze in fear when their gaze met hers. She felt their tiny form in her palm as she reached down, too fast for them to react. As she lifted the tiny dancer toward her lips, Lena's mind screamed for her to stop. "This isn't you." But her hands were already moving on their own, lifting the tiny body closer to her mouth. The dancer's terrified eyes met hers, but she could not stop. The hunger was all-consuming. The emptiness inside her was so deep, so vast, and this was the only way she knew to fill it. But just as her lips parted, something inside her broke through the fog. No, she couldn't do this. She loved these dancers. She had worked so hard alongside them. They were her team, her friends. The idea of harming them, of taking away their lives, was unimaginable. She stopped. Her hand trembled, holding the tiny dancer in mid-air. The dancer in her palm was trembling too, their small body shivering with fear. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time, the hunger inside her began to fade, replaced by something else. Regret. Shame. The power of the dream began to slip away. The strange, overwhelming sensation of hunger, of primal desire, ebbed like a tide retreating from the shore. Lena pulled her hand away from her mouth and set the tiny dancer gently on the ground, watching as they scrambled away, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. Lena stood frozen, her breath shallow as she tried to process what had just happened. Her mind was still foggy, but now there was clarity, and the clarity brought guilt, deep, gut-wrenching guilt. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the dream, trying to return to the real world. Lena's thoughts drifted into an unsettling reverie, the growing hunger gnawing at her thoughts. She could feel the ache in her stomach intensifying, the emptiness inside her taking on an almost tactile form, like a void that yearned to be filled. In the silence of the dreamlike forest, her mind wandered, lost in the vivid imagination of what it would feel like to give in, to surrender to the overwhelming urge that consumed her. In her mind, Lena pictured herself standing tall, her body poised as always, but now with a deep, unsettling hunger in her eyes. The tiny backup dancers, once small and delicate figures beneath her, now seemed so fragile, so breakable. She imagined them in a neat line, each of them taking a small step forward, one after the other, as though they were marching toward something, toward her. They moved with grace and elegance, their tiny bodies dancing in perfect rhythm, unaware of the dark thoughts that stirred within Lena. She visualized herself opening her mouth, the action slow and deliberate, as if to invite them into her world. The warm, wet air from her mouth rushed over her lips, a deep breath rising from her chest as her tongue lightly flicked across her teeth. She could almost hear the soft sound of their feet as they moved closer, the tiny shuffle of their steps, until they reached the edge of her mouth. Her lips parted wider, and the dancers, now like little specks to her, continued their synchronized movement, one by one, making their way toward her. Lena's mind was heavy with anticipation as she imagined them entering, their forms so small that they barely made a sound. She could feel her breath quickening, her body tensing as the dancers, one by one, danced their way into her mouth. The first dancer stepped onto her tongue, their tiny form nearly invisible in the vast expanse of her mouth. Lena imagined the sensation of their delicate body against her taste buds, the feeling of their soft form resting briefly before she gently lifted them higher, toward the back of her throat. She could almost taste the sweetness of their skin, the flavor of their energy as they moved against her, unaware of the fate that awaited them. The rest of the dancers followed, each one stepping lightly into her mouth, their movements graceful and fluid as they joined the first. Lena's heart raced in time with the dancers' movements, her mouth feeling fuller with each tiny figure that entered. She could feel the tiny bodies shifting around inside her, moving against the walls of her mouth as she adjusted, allowing them to dance freely. The sensation was strangely comforting and unnerving at once, their movements so delicate, their presence so small, yet their significance in her mind growing with each passing second. As the last dancer entered her mouth, the entire space seemed to fill with their tiny forms. She could feel them, soft, warm, alive, each one a separate being, yet all so intimately close. Lena's tongue moved instinctively, exploring the tiny dancers who now rested against the roof of her mouth, shifting from one side to the other, their bodies pressed against her palate and teeth. She imagined their soft forms rubbing against her tongue as if they were little treasures, delicate and fragile. The hunger inside her grew stronger, a wave of need crashing over her with the realization that they were now inside her. The emptiness inside her stomach seemed to vanish for a brief moment, replaced by the satisfaction of having them close, of having them with her. Her thoughts spun in circles as she imagined what it would feel like to swallow them, to feel them slide down into the depths of her, filling the void that had once been unbearable. But even as she imagined the next step, the swallowing, the guilt began to creep in. Her mind paused, uncertain, overwhelmed by the conflicting emotions of desire and remorse. These were her friends, her backup dancers, the people who had supported her, laughed with her, and helped her succeed. How could she even think of consuming them, of ending their dance so easily? The deep connection she had with them, the bond forged through countless hours of practice, felt too precious to betray. In that moment, her thoughts began to calm, the hunger receding like a tide pulling away from the shore. The dancers, in her mind, remained safe, still dancing and twirling on her tongue, still part of her dream but not yet her prey. She closed her mouth slowly, her lips gently sealing the vision away. The hunger still lingered, still burned inside her, but for now, it would remain unfulfilled. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she awoke from the fantasy, her heart racing, the sounds of her stomach growling once again, but more distant now. The dream was over, but the feeling of their tiny bodies, their delicate movements, would remain with her. And as she took a step back, grounding herself in reality, Lena knew that her journey was far from over. The hunger, the temptation, the inner conflict, it was all part of who she was now. But in that moment, it was just a lingering thought, waiting for the next time it would rise to the surface. When Lena opened her eyes again, she was back in the familiar studio. The mirrors were back, the wooden floor polished, the faint hum of the air conditioning the only noise filling the room. The dancers were still there, still practicing, completely unaware of what had just happened. She glanced around, feeling her heartbeat slowly return to normal. She could still feel the residual ache in her stomach, but it wasn't the same. The dream had passed, and with it, the overwhelming hunger had subsided. Lena let out a shaky breath, feeling the weight of the moment. It had been a strange, surreal experience, and for a moment she had lost herself in the feeling of power, of hunger, of something dark and primal. But that wasn't her. Lena had always prided herself on control. Control over her body, over her art, over her emotions. She would never lose herself to something as primal as hunger. The dancers continued to practice, unaware of her internal battle. Lena watched them for a moment, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over her. These were her friends, her family. She couldn't imagine hurting them. She would never hurt them. After a moment of reflection, Lena stood up, smiling softly to herself. She knew what she needed to do. She needed to eat.